My tranquil creek turned into a battlefield when the Homeowners Association, HOA, declared it a menace to children and demanded I drain it. They never anticipated what would happen when that water found a new path. What would you do if the people who destroyed your sanctuary suddenly found their own homes sinking into a swamp of their own creation? Water lapped against my worn work boots as I strolled along my creek bed, the gentle babbling, a soothing balm after 11 long years. Birds chirped a cheerful melody overhead, while dragonflies, iridescent jewels, skimmed across the water's surface. This little stream, meandering through my backyard in Riverstone Heights, was my personal slice of heaven. After grueling days spent fixing other people's plumbing nightmares, I'd sit here, feeling the stress melt away like ice cream on a hot summer day. "Hey, Mr. Jones." I turned to see little Lucas and Ava Miller waving enthusiastically from the edge of my property. These neighborhood kids were frequent visitors, their faces alight with the thrill of catching frogs or watching minnows dart between the smooth river stones. "Can we look for tadpoles today, Mr. Jones?" Lucas called out, his voice brimming with anticipation. "Sure thing," I replied, a warm smile spreading across my face. "Just remember to put them back when you're done, all right?" I watched them, my heart filled with a quiet contentment, as they carefully hopped from stone to stone, their parents perfectly comfortable, letting them explore under my watchful eye. My creek wasn't deep, barely reaching my ankles even at its fullest, but it teemed with tiny, fascinating creatures that captivated the neighborhood children. Little did I know, this idyllic scene was about to be shattered. The first sign of trouble arrived in the mail a week later, a thick, intimidating envelope emblazoned with Maple Valley Homeowners Association in ostentatious gold lettering. Strange, I thought, a knot of unease forming in my stomach. Our area had never had an HOA before. Inside, a welcome letter explained that our previously unregulated neighborhood had been absorbed into the existing Maple Valley HOA from the newer development next door. I frowned, my eyes scanning the attached paperwork. Monthly dues, architectural review requirements, and pages upon pages of regulations governing everything from grass height, no more than 3 inches, to the permissible color of holiday decorations. At the very bottom, a signature line loomed, accompanied by an ominous note. Failure to return, signed agreement within 30 days, constitutes acceptance of terms. I tossed it aside, intending to simply ignore it. A futile hope. That strategy lasted precisely 3 days, until Brenda Kirkpatrick materialized at my doorstep. "Good afternoon," she said, her smile tight and practiced, like a mask she'd worn too many times. "I'm Brenda Kirkpatrick, the Community Standards Director for Maple Valley HOA. I noticed you haven't returned your membership agreement." "I'm not interested in joining," I stated plainly, hoping my bluntness would deter her. Her smile didn't falter, not even a flicker. "I'm afraid it's not optional, Mr. Jones. Your property deed includes a provision allowing for HOA formation if 75% of area homeowners agree, and we've reached that threshold." "That can't be right," I protested, my voice rising in disbelief. "I've owned this place for over a decade." "The provision was always there," she said, handing me a highlighted copy of what, to my dismay, appeared to be a legitimate excerpt from my property documents. "Previous owners simply never activated it. We're just helping bring consistency to the entire area." Reluctantly, my hand trembling slightly, I signed the papers. A heavy knot of dread settled in my stomach as I handed them back. "Wonderful," Brenda chirped, tucking the documents neatly into her folder. "Our first neighborhood meeting is Thursday night." She peered over my shoulder, her gaze fixated on my backyard. "And we'll need to discuss that unauthorized water feature." "Water feature?" I sputtered, incredulous. It's a natural creek. It was here before my house was even built. Natural or not, it poses safety concerns, Brenda retorted, her voice hardening. The Miller children could wander in and get hurt. I was speechless. The Millers brought their kids here specifically to play in the creek. They loved it. Well, Mr. Jones, Brenda continued, her tone now laced with a hint of condescension, unattended water features are against HOA regulations. We'll address it at the meeting. Thursday evening found me sitting in a stiff, uncomfortable folding chair in the community center, surrounded by neighbors who looked equally bewildered about this sudden HOA takeover. Brenda stood at the front, flanked by a man she introduced as Bob Kirkpatrick, HOA president, and not coincidentally, her husband. We're thrilled to welcome Riverstone Heights residents to the Maple Valley family, Bob announced, his voice booming with forced enthusiasm. Your homes will benefit from our proven property value protection strategies. I glanced around. Some neighbors nodded appreciatively, while others, like me, wore expressions of skeptical disbelief. The meeting dragged on. A tedious parade of discussions about mailbox standardization. Only beige, model number 4B, was acceptable, and approved fence heights, no higher than 6 feet, and only cedar. Just when I thought they'd miraculously forgotten about my creek, Brenda clicked to a new slide in her PowerPoint presentation, a photograph of my backyard, my beloved creek prominently displayed. Moving on to safety concerns, she said, her voice dripping with feigned concern. This unauthorized water feature on Elm Street poses an immediate drowning risk to children. I stood up, my voice shaking with barely suppressed anger. That's my property, and that's a natural creek that's been there for decades. It's not some feature I installed. The bylaws clearly state that all water features must be approved and properly fenced, Brenda replied, not even bothering to address my point. It's literally 4 inches deep, I countered, my voice rising in frustration. Mrs. Miller, bless her heart, raised her hand. My children play in that creek all the time. It's perfectly safe. Brenda's eyes narrowed, her smile vanishing. And do you have liability insurance covering potential accidents on Mr. Jones's property, Mrs. Miller? The question hung in the air, silencing the room. The rules exist for everyone's protection, Bob added smoothly, stepping forward. We'll need that creek either properly fenced, with a locking gate, or filled in within 30 days. After the meeting, I approached the Kirkpatricks, my jaw clenched. A fence around a natural waterway makes absolutely no sense. Wildlife needs access. Wildlife is another issue entirely, Brenda said, wrinkling her nose in disgust. Raccoons, possums, they carry diseases. The creek attracts them to our neighborhood. Your neighborhood, I retorted, my voice laced with sarcasm. I've lived here way longer than you have. Bob placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. Look, we're just following the bylaws everyone agreed to. We'll be sending an inspection team tomorrow. I'd suggest compliance. The fines can add up quickly. I shrugged off his hand, my mind racing. Something about this felt profoundly wrong, far beyond the obvious overreach. Back home, I pulled out my property survey, studying it intently under the harsh glare of my kitchen light. The creek entered my property from the northeast corner, flowing from the direction of the newer development, where, coincidentally, the Kirkpatricks had their McMansion. I grabbed a powerful flashlight and ventured out into the growing darkness, following the creek upstream, beyond my property line. I traced it through a wooded area, separating the developments, until I found myself at the edge of a small retention pond behind the newer homes. As my light swept across the water, something metallic glinted back at me. Wading carefully to the edge, I discovered a drainage pipe, partially concealed by a thicket of cattails, a pipe that fed directly into my creek. I pulled out my phone, snapping several photos. Then I followed the pipe back toward the houses. It led straight to the newest section of the development, right where the Kirkpatricks and other HOA board members all resided. I was still piecing it all together when the sound of an approaching golf cart sent me diving behind a thick oak tree. Through the leaves, I watched Bob Kirkpatrick drive up to the pond's edge. He dismounted, looked around cautiously, then dumped something, a white, powdery substance, from a large container into the water. As he drove away, I crept forward, shining my light on the pond's surface. Dead fish, their silvery scales dull and lifeless, floated belly up where he had poured whatever was in that container. My phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor, Jamie Lee. "Check your email. HOA just sent violation notice. $500 fine for unapproved water feature. Says drain creek in 30 days or $100 daily penalty." I stared at the message, then back at the poisoned pond. This wasn't about safety or rules. Something much bigger was happening, and my little creek had somehow become the epicenter of it all. The inspection team arrived at precisely 7:30 the next morning. Brenda Kirkpatrick, accompanied by two men I recognized from the meeting as fellow board members. I watched from my kitchen window, my blood simmering, as they marched across my lawn, without so much as a "by your leave." "Good morning," I called out, stepping onto my porch, trying to maintain a semblance of civility. "Can I help you?" "Official HOA inspection," Brenda announced, barely glancing my way. She was already snapping photos with her phone, pointing at my creek and murmuring to her companions. I followed them around my property, my frustration mounting with each passing minute as they trampled my carefully tended vegetable garden to get a better angle of the creek. "Those are my tomato plants you're standing on," I said, my voice tight with restraint. "You'll need to move this garden anyway," Brenda replied without looking up. "Vegetable gardens must be in backyard areas, not visible from the street." "It is in my backyard." "Visible from the side street," she countered, pointing toward the road that ran along the far edge of my property. Section 8, Paragraph 3 of the bylaws. For 45 excruciating minutes, they photographed, measured, and made copious notes about my creek. Brenda's face lit up with perverse glee each time she found something new to criticize. Excessive wildlife attraction, improper plant species, potential mosquito breeding ground. "Those are native plants that naturally grow along waterways," I argued, my voice rising in exasperation. "And moving water doesn't breed mosquitoes, standing water does." Brenda smiled thinly. "Are you an environmental scientist, Mr. Jones?" "No, I'm a plumber who understands water systems." "Well, I'm sure the board will take your expertise into consideration." After they left, I called the only lawyer I knew, Martha Rodriguez, who had helped with my mother's will last year. "HOAs have considerable power," she explained after hearing my predicament. "Your agreement gives them authority to regulate aesthetic and safety issues." "But it's a natural creek. It's been here longer than any of the houses." She sighed. "Doesn't matter in HOA law. They can regulate anything visible on your property. You can fight it, but honestly, it could take years and thousands of dollars in legal fees." 3 days later, the certified letter arrived, a $500 fine for an unapproved water feature, with orders to drain the creek within 30 days or face additional daily penalties of $100. That evening, Mrs. Miller knocked on my door, her children, Lucas and Ava, hovering behind her, their faces etched with worry. "We heard about the creek," she said apologetically. "The kids are heartbroken." Lucas looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed. "Can't you save the frogs, Mr. Jones?" "I'm trying, buddy," I promised, though I had absolutely no idea how. After they left, I spread out maps of the neighborhood on my kitchen table. Something still didn't add up about the Kirkpatricks' aggressive push to eliminate my creek. I found an old geological survey online and compared it with current property maps. The creek didn't start on my property. It originated from an underground spring near the highest point of the neighborhood, which was now covered by the newest section of homes, including the Kirkpatrick's sprawling mansion. The next day, I visited the county records office, hoping to unearth more information about the development's water management plan. As I was poring over property documents, someone tapped my shoulder. "Fighting the creek battle?" a friendly voice asked. It was Jamie Lee, my neighbor from 2 streets over. Her warm smile was a welcome sight. "How did you know?" "We've all been there," she said grimly. "They forced me to remove my koi pond last month. It had been there for 15 years. My grandmother cried for days. It reminded her of home." "I'm so sorry," I said, suddenly realizing I wasn't the only victim of the HOA's overreach. Jamie glanced at the map spread before me. "Finding anything interesting?" "Maybe. Did you know this whole area used to be wetland? The developer filled it in to build those new houses." Her eyebrows rose. "Including the Kirkpatrick's place? Especially their section. And get this, I think they're diverting groundwater through my creek. I found a drainage pipe leading from their retention pond." Jamie's expression hardened. "You should talk to Dr. Martinez at the community college. He fought the development 5 years ago, said it would cause drainage problems. Nobody listened." That afternoon, I found Dr. Martinez in his cramped, cluttered office, surrounded by towering stacks of environmental impact reports. "Of course, I remember that development," he said, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Terrible plan. They built on a natural spring system without proper mitigation." He pulled out a topographical map. "See these blue lines? Underground water channels. They run right under those new houses. And drain into my creek," I added, finishing his sentence. He nodded emphatically. "Exactly. Your creek is an essential relief valve for groundwater pressure. If you close it off," he made an explosive gesture with his hands. "The water has to go somewhere," I murmured, a chilling realization dawning on me. "Physics always wins," Dr. Martinez agreed. "Water follows the path of least resistance." Armed with this crucial knowledge, I attended the next HOA meeting. When it came time for resident comments, I approached the microphone. "I'd like to discuss the environmental impact of removing my creek," I began. "According to geological surveys, it's part of a critical watershed system that helps prevent flooding." Brenda immediately cut me off. "The association has already consulted experts on this matter." "Which experts?" I challenged, my voice echoing through the room. "Because I've spoken with Dr. Martinez from the Environmental Science Department, and he—" "We're not here to debate settled issues," Bob interrupted, his face turning red. "The violation stands. Next speaker, please." As I returned to my seat, I noticed several neighbors giving me thoughtful, considering looks. After the meeting, Mrs. Miller and 3 other homeowners approached me in the parking lot. "We believe you," Mrs. Miller said quietly. "Brenda's been using safety concerns to control everyone. Last month, she made the Patels remove their decades-old oak tree because acorns are a choking hazard. I'm fighting this," I told them, "but I need help." That night, as rain poured down in sheets, I sat in my car across from my property, watching the crew the HOA had hired. Under the harsh glare of portable floodlights, men in yellow raincoats dug trenches and laid large pipes, diverting my creek underground. By morning, my beautiful creek bed lay empty and desolate, nothing but exposed rocks and mud where water had flowed for centuries. I felt hollow inside, a gaping void where my sanctuary had once been. I walked the lifeless creek bed, picking up stranded minnows and relocating them to a bucket of water. The Miller children helped silently, their faces solemn as they rescued what creatures they could. "Where will the water go now, Mr. Jones?" Lucas asked, his voice barely a whisper. I looked toward the Kirkpatrick's neighborhood on the hill. "That's what I'm wondering too." The answer came 3 days later, as the storm intensified. I was awakened at 2 a.m. by frantic pounding on my door. It was Jamie, soaking wet and wide-eyed. "You need to see this," she gasped. "Bring your camera." I followed her through the torrential downpour to the newest section of the development. As we rounded the corner onto Maple Drive, I stopped dead in my tracks, my jaw dropping in disbelief. Water bubbled up through storm drains, flooding the street ankle-deep. Several homeowners were outside with flashlights, desperately trying to direct the water away from their foundations. And there, in the center of it all, stood the Kirkpatricks, in matching monogrammed raincoats, Bob shouting at someone on his phone, while Brenda directed neighbors to place sandbags around their property, and only their property. "The sewers are backing up too," Jamie whispered. "3 houses already have basement flooding." I remembered Dr. Martinez's words. Water follows the path of least resistance. With my creek gone, the groundwater had found a new route, right under the homes of those who had destroyed its natural path. From the shadow of a large oak tree, I took photos and videos documenting everything. As dawn broke, I noticed something even more interesting. The ground around several foundations was visibly shifting, tiny rivulets forming between houses as the earth became saturated. The Kirkpatricks' grand house sat at the highest point, seemingly safe for now. But physics always wins, and water, like truth, has a way of rising to the surface. They had no idea what forces they'd unleashed, but they were about to find out. "You have 30 days to comply." Those words from the HOA notice, now a crumpled ball in my fist, burned in my memory as I stood in the relentless rain, watching the remnants of my beloved creek. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the water that had been a part of this land long before any houses, any HOAs, had ever existed. A deep, unsettling feeling washed over me. This wasn't just about my creek anymore. I couldn't sleep that night. Instead, I pulled out my laptop and started searching. What rights did I have? What exactly was this creek? My seemingly simple questions led me down a rabbit hole I never anticipated. By sunrise, my kitchen table was buried under a mountain of printouts, watershed maps, property surveys, and dusty county records. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, but what I discovered sent a jolt of adrenaline through me, sharper than any coffee. This wasn't just any creek. It was part of the Riverstone Heights watershed system, a critical drainage point for the entire neighborhood. "Look at this," I said to my neighbor, Sam, when he stopped by with a much-needed thermos of coffee. I pointed to the oldest map, dated 1962, its edges frayed and yellowed. "See how the water naturally flows? It comes from an underground spring up by the hilltop, where Brenda and Bob built their monstrosity." Sam adjusted his glasses, peering at the map. "Wait, so if they stop your creek, the water has to go somewhere," he finished, his voice laced with understanding. "Exactly," I said, a grim satisfaction settling in. "It doesn't just disappear." I needed an expert opinion, someone who could confirm my rapidly forming theory. So I called the local university. Dr. Martinez, an environmental science professor with a shock of gray-streaked hair and perpetually mud-caked boots, agreed to visit that afternoon. She walked the length of my property, meticulously testing soil samples and taking precise measurements. Rain dripped from the brim of her hat as she crouched beside the now barren creek bed. "This is a textbook example of a natural drainage system," she explained, scooping up some of the remaining damp earth in a jar. "These tiny organisms, they're indicators of healthy water flow. Disrupting this, it could have serious repercussions for the surrounding area." She pointed toward the higher ground, where the ostentatious houses of the newer development stood. "Your neighborhood was built on what used to be wetlands. Developers installed drainage systems, yes, but they rely on natural waterways like this creek to function properly. Armed with this powerful validation, I requested to speak at the next HOA meeting. Brenda's face twisted with undisguised annoyance when I approached the microphone. "I've consulted with environmental experts," I began, my voice clear and steady, slides of watershed maps appearing on the screen behind me. "This creek isn't just pretty, it's functional. It prevents flooding by channeling water safely away from our homes." Brenda cut me off mid-sentence, her voice sharp and dismissive. "The association has already consulted qualified experts on this matter," she said, tapping her perfectly manicured nails on the table. I couldn't help myself. The words tumbled out before I could stop them. "Which experts exactly? Because I've called every environmental consultant in the county and none of them have been contacted by the HOA. Murmurs rippled through the room, a wave of hushed whispers and uneasy glances. Bob Kirkpatrick cleared his throat loudly, his face turning a mottled shade of red. "That's confidential information. Next agenda item, please." Walking to my car afterward, I heard someone call my name. It was Margaret Joe, an older woman who lived near the community entrance, her eyes filled with a knowing sadness. "I worked for the county water department for 30 years before retiring," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "What you said in there, it was right. They're making a terrible mistake." She pressed a weathered business card into my hand. "Call my old colleague at the water department. Tell him Maggie sent you." 3 days later, I met Tom Richardson from the county water department for coffee. He brought historical flood maps that confirmed my worst suspicions. "Your HOA president lives here?" he asked, circling an area on the map with a thick red pen. This whole section was classified as a seasonal wetland until 2015, when the zoning was mysteriously changed. "How could that happen?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Tom shrugged, a cynical expression on his face. "Money talks, but changing paperwork doesn't change geology. Water follows gravity, not HOA bylaws." That evening, I received an email from the HOA. My deadline to remove the creek had been moved up. They were sending contractors tomorrow. I felt physically ill watching the heavy machinery arrive the next morning. Massive excavators tore into my backyard, the earth groaning in protest. As Brenda stood by her SUV, arms crossed, a smug expression of triumph on her face. By sunset, my beautiful creek was gone, diverted into underground pipes. The exposed creek bed looked like an open wound, a raw, gaping scar across my property. That night, a monstrous storm, a true deluge, hit our area. I sat on my back porch, listening to the rain hammer against the roof, a knot of dread twisting in my gut. Around midnight, my phone lit up with a flurry of notifications from the neighborhood chat group. "Anyone else's basement flooding? Water coming through my walls on Maple Drive. Sewage backing up in downstairs bathroom. Help!" I pulled on my raincoat and boots, grabbed a powerful flashlight, and ventured out into the storm. Water pooled in the streets, but something caught my attention. The flooding wasn't random, it was concentrated around certain homes, particularly those near Brenda and Bob Kirkpatrick's property. Following a hunch, I sloshed through ankle-deep water toward their street. What I saw made me gasp. Water bubbled up through their perfectly manicured lawns like unnatural springs. The ground around several foundations was visibly shifting, with muddy water seeping from beneath concrete slabs. My phone rang. It was Jamie Lee. "My basement is completely flooded, and I'm not the only one." "I know," I said, my voice strangely calm, watching as Bob frantically tried to divert water from his garage with a broom. A futile, pathetic effort. "I'm looking at it right now." "What's causing this?" she asked, her voice laced with panic. I felt a strange mix of vindication and dread as I answered. The creek. The water had to go somewhere, Jamie. It followed the path of least resistance, right under the homes of those who destroyed its natural course. As lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the scene with stark clarity, I noticed something even more alarming. A hairline crack had appeared along the side of Brenda's house, growing wider, more menacing with each passing moment as water continued to push up from below. My creek hadn't disappeared. It had simply found a new path, a path that would soon teach the HOA a lesson they'd never forget. But even I couldn't have predicted the sheer scale of what would happen next. Sirens wailed through the neighborhood at dawn, a cacophony of noise and flashing lights. Emergency vehicles lined Brenda and Bob's street as crews frantically pumped water from flooded basements. I stood among a growing crowd of concerned neighbors, watching the chaos unfold. "Emergency HOA meeting, tonight at 7 o'clock, Bob shouted through a megaphone, his designer shoes squelching in the mud. His perfect lawn had transformed into a soggy, swampy mess overnight. News vans arrived by mid-morning, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. A reporter thrust a microphone in my face. "Sir, you live downstream from the affected homes. Has your property experienced any flooding?" "Strangely, no," I replied truthfully. "My property used to have a natural creek that helped control water flow, but the HOA forced me to remove it last week." The reporter's eyebrows shot up. "The creek was removed right before this flooding occurred?" Brenda appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, inserting herself between us, her face a mask of carefully controlled fury. "The timing is purely coincidental. This is clearly a city infrastructure failure." She yanked the reporter away, eager to show her the emergency pumps, a desperate attempt to deflect blame. My phone buzzed with a text from Jamie. "Did you see what happened to the Miller's house? It's the worst on the block." I hadn't. Making my way to their property, I found Ava Miller sitting on her front steps, surrounded by soaked photo albums and treasured family heirlooms. Her husband, Dan, carried waterlogged items to the curb, his face etched with despair. These were the people whose children Brenda had used as an excuse to target my creek. "I'm so sorry," I said, genuinely meaning it. "They weren't my enemies." Ava looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with a heartbreaking mixture of grief and exhaustion. "Our insurance agent just left. They won't cover anything. They're classifying it as surface water intrusion. The adjuster said something about us being in an unmapped flood zone." I helped them carry furniture to higher ground as she explained how water had bubbled up through their basement floor like a spring, ruining everything stored there, including her grandmother's handmade quilts and their children's precious baby memorabilia. The community center buzzed with angry voices that evening. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls, their faces a mixture of fear, frustration, and simmering rage. Neighbors who had never spoken at meetings before were now demanding answers. Brenda rapped her gavel repeatedly, trying to maintain a semblance of control. "This meeting will come to order. Our first agenda item is the unprecedented flooding event." Bob stepped forward, adjusting his tie, his voice strained. "The board has been in contact with city officials. This appears to be a city infrastructure failure. Rest assured, we are demanding immediate action." Several homeowners shouted questions simultaneously, a chorus of accroche and disbelief. Brenda pointed to a man in the front row, her hand shaking slightly. "My basement has flooded 3 times this week. Who's paying for this damage?" he demanded. "Your homeowner's insurance," Brenda began. "They denied my claim," someone else interrupted, "said it's not covered because we're on what used to be wetlands." I raised my hand, patiently waiting until Brenda, with obvious reluctance, acknowledged me. "I've been researching our neighborhood's geological history," I said, connecting my laptop to the projector. "What we're experiencing isn't unprecedented at all." My presentation showed historical maps of the area dating back to 1962, before the development began. Our entire neighborhood was built on natural wetlands. The developers installed drainage systems, including natural waterways like the creek on my property. I clicked to the next slide, a county survey map highlighting water flow patterns. When the HOA ordered me to remove my creek last week, they eliminated a critical drainage point. Brenda's face flushed a deep crimson. "This is absurd. Are you suggesting we caused this disaster?" "I'm not suggesting anything," I replied evenly. "I'm stating hydrological facts. Water always follows the path of least resistance. In this case, right under the foundations of homes built on fill-in wetlands." Bob stormed to the front, his face contorted with rage. "This sounds like a threat. Are you admitting responsibility for this damage?" "I didn't redirect the creek," I said, looking him directly in the eyes. "The HOA did, against my warnings and expert advice." The room erupted. Parents whose children had supposedly been at risk from my creek now faced tens of thousands of dollars in water damage. Homeowners who had remained silent during previous HOA overreach were suddenly demanding answers, their voices rising in a crescendo of fury. Margaret Joe, the retired water department employee, spoke up, her voice clear and resolute. "I've contacted my former colleagues at the county. They're sending engineers tomorrow to assess the situation." "The HOA has not authorized any county inspections," Brenda protested, her voice shrill. "They don't need HOA permission," Margaret replied calmly. "This is now classified as a potential public health emergency." The meeting dissolved into chaos. As I packed up my materials, Ava Miller approached me, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. "The water in our basement? It keeps coming back, no matter how many times we pump it out," she whispered. "Our foundation is cracking. The HOA is telling us to handle it ourselves, but we can't afford these repairs. How many other families are in the same situation?" "At least 12 on our street alone," she replied, her voice trembling. "We need your help. You seem to understand what's happening better than anyone." I hesitated. Getting involved could make me an even bigger target for Brenda and Bob's wrath. But looking at Ava's exhausted, desperate face, I knew I couldn't stand idly by. "I'll help, on one condition," I finally said. "When the time comes, we vote for new HOA leadership." Ava nodded firmly, her eyes filled with a flicker of hope. "Just tell us what to do." The county engineers arrived the next morning, taking soil samples and conducting ground-penetrating radar surveys. I walked with them, pointing out where my creek had been and how water now pooled in unexpected, unnatural places. "This is exactly what we warned the developers about 15 years ago," the lead engineer muttered, shaking his head. "You can't just fill in wetlands and expect water to cooperate." Their official report arrived 3 days later, via certified mail to all homeowners. Its conclusion was damning. The recent flooding is directly attributable to the unauthorized modification of natural drainage systems, specifically the removal of the creek at 247 Meadowlark Lane. I barely slept that night, knowing the report named my address specifically. When morning came, I stepped outside to find all 4 of my car tires slashed. A note had been tucked under my windshield wiper: "Back off or else." Rather than intimidating me, the threat solidified my resolve. I photographed everything, called the police, and then reached out to the local newspaper. The reporter who had interviewed me earlier jumped at the follow-up story. "HOA blamed for neighborhood flooding," read the headline 2 days later. The article detailed how the HOA had ignored expert advice and forced the removal of a natural drainage feature, leading to significant property damage for multiple homeowners. My phone rang non-stop with calls from neighbors I'd never even spoken to before. They shared stories of other HOA abuses, arbitrary fines, selective enforcement. personal vendettas. They made me remove my son's basketball hoop because it was 2 inches taller than regulation, one father told me, his voice filled with frustration. Meanwhile, Bob's boat has been parked in his driveway for months, against the same rules. What had begun as a fight for my creek had evolved into something much larger. The HOA had awakened a sleeping giant, a community tired of petty tyranny. That evening, as I helped the Millers install water barriers around their foundation, I noticed Brenda and Bob watching from their car across the street. When they saw me looking, they quickly drove away. The neighborhood group chat pinged with an urgent message from Jamie. Emergency meeting at my house. Tomorrow, 1 p.m. Do not discuss on this chat. Spread the word personally. I sensed a revolution brewing. The water that once flowed peacefully through my land was about to become a flood of change that even Brenda and Bob Kirkpatrick couldn't control. Someone slashed my tires, I told Officer Miller, as he took photos of my car and carefully placed the threatening note in a plastic evidence bag. And left this. Any idea who might have done this? He asked, his gaze unwavering. The HOA president and his wife aren't exactly happy with me right now, I replied dryly. My phone buzzed. A text from Jamie. Emergency meeting at my house, now. When I arrived, people were crammed into Jamie's living room, the air thick with worry, anger, and a palpable sense of desperation. My kid's bedroom ceiling caved in last night, Ava Miller said, showing us pictures on her phone of soaked stuffed animals and ruined books. Her voice cracked with emotion. They're staying with my parents now. Michael Rodriguez stood up, his hands shaking. 3 feet of water in my basement. My daughter's quinceañera dress, it was in storage down there. It was my grandmother's from Mexico. Gone. My insurance is dropping me, added Taylor Williams, clutching a crumpled letter. They're calling our homes high-risk flood zones now. The room exploded with stories, ruined family photos, mold growing on walls, cars stuck in mud, lives irrevocably disrupted. Brenda keeps saying it's a city problem, Jamie said, her voice tight with anger. But the city engineer told me privately it's because of the creek diversion. I cleared my throat. I found something. I spread the old property maps across Jamie's coffee table. These show the original water paths before development. Look familiar? Everyone leaned in, their eyes scanning the faded lines and contours. The flooding pattern matched exactly where water used to flow naturally. The HOA has broken at least 6 environmental regulations, I explained. I've been talking to a reporter from the Tribune who's interested in our story. We've tried playing nice, said Jamie, her voice rising. Where has that gotten us? I pointed to specific spots on the map. These 7 drainage points used to let water flow naturally. When they built over them, they installed drainage pipes that were never meant to handle this much water. What if we just fixed them? A plan was formed quickly and decisively. We created a group chat called Weekend Gardening Club to avoid suspicion. Saturday morning, 20 of us gathered, armed with shovels, pickaxes, and wheelbarrows, ostensibly to work on the community garden plot. We split into teams. My group tackled the drainage point behind the community center. We dug through compacted soil, years of accumulated debris, and, shockingly, construction trash, finally revealing the original stream bed. Look, Sarah called out, holding up a twisted piece of plastic sheeting. They literally covered the natural drain with garbage. We worked all day under the scorching sun, sweat soaking our shirts, our muscles aching, but our spirits buoyed by a shared sense of purpose. Old Mr. Jenkins, who lived next to the community center, brought us ice-cold lemonade. Even kids joined in, making a game of carrying small rocks and pebbles, their laughter a welcome counterpoint to the grim task at hand. Around 4 p.m., a black SUV screeched to a halt at the edge of the common area. Brenda Kirkpatrick jumped out, her face a mask of fury, her perfectly coiffed hair slightly askew. "This is vandalism," she shrieked, her voice cracking with rage. "I'm calling the police." I walked over calmly, covered in mud, my clothes streaked with dirt, but a small, defiant smile playing on my lips. "Hello, Brenda. We're just helping maintain proper drainage as per Section 12.3 of the HOA bylaws," I said, handing her a laminated copy which I'd conveniently prepared. It clearly stated, "Homeowners may perform maintenance on drainage systems to preserve property values." "This isn't maintenance, it's destruction," she sputtered, her face turning an alarming shade of purple. By then, other neighbors had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Even families who weren't directly affected by the flooding came to watch. A silent, watchful audience. "Is it destruction to prevent our homes from flooding?" asked Taylor, stepping forward, her voice clear and strong. "Or is it destruction to ignore the warnings of environmental experts and pipe away a natural creek?" Brenda's husband, Bob, appeared, pulling her aside. I could see them arguing, Bob looking increasingly worried as he pointed at the growing crowd of neighbors, their faces a mixture of anger and determination. As evening approached, dark, ominous clouds gathered overhead. The forecast called for heavy rain overnight. We worked faster, driven by a sense of urgency, completing 3 critical drainage channels. "Do you think it will work?" Jamie asked as we put away our tools, our bodies exhausted, but our spirits strangely exhilarated. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, guttural growl. I looked at our handiwork, the newly exposed earth, the gently sloping channels. "There's only one way to find out," I said, a shiver of anticipation running down my spine. That night, rain pounded against my windows, a relentless drumming that echoed the pounding in my heart. I couldn't sleep, wondering if our desperate, last-ditch effort would help or make things even worse. At dawn, I pulled on boots and a raincoat and walked through the neighborhood. Where before there had been street flooding, now the water flowed smoothly, purposefully, through our newly restored channels. I followed the main path all the way to its end point, the Kirkpatrick's backyard. There, where Brenda had once hosted her prize-winning garden parties, stood a perfect, pristine pond, water gently flowing through it, exactly as the original wetland had been. And at the edge of this new pond, staring in disbelief at her reflection in the water, stood Brenda, her perfectly crafted facade crumbling like the foundations of her house. Cameras flashed as the local news crew filmed Brenda's newly formed backyard pond. Homeowners claim HOA negligence led to neighborhood flooding, the reporter announced, microphone in hand. Behind her, neighbors pointed at water damage to their homes, their faces etched with a mixture of anger and relief. Brenda pushed through the crowd, her designer shoes sinking into the mud. "Turn those cameras off. This is private property." "Actually," the reporter responded, a sly smile playing on her lips, "we're standing on the community easement, as noted in county records." She turned to Brenda, her voice dripping with professionalism. "Would you like to comment on reports that your HOA ignored environmental warnings before redirecting a natural waterway?" Bob appeared, pulling Brenda back, his face pale and drawn. "No comment. We'll be issuing a statement through our attorney." The story aired that evening. By morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing, a constant stream of messages from neighbors I'd never even spoken to before. "Emergency HOA meeting tonight. Read the official email. Attendance mandatory. Failure to attend will result in automatic approval of all measures." The community center parking lot overflowed. Inside, every seat was filled, with homeowners clutching papers and wearing expressions of fierce determination. Bob and Brenda sat at the front table with the other board members, their faces tight with stress and a palpable sense of dread. Bob banged his gavel 3 times, his hand trembling slightly. This meeting will address the unauthorized landscape modifications that have damaged neighborhood aesthetics and property values. That's not why we're here, called out Michael Rodriguez from the back. He stood, holding up his phone. I've been on with FEMA all day. They're considering classifying our flood damage as a disaster caused by man-made water diversion. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a wave of hushed outrage. Furthermore, added Taylor Williams, her voice ringing with authority, I've received word from my insurance company that they're considering a class action lawsuit against the HOA for knowingly creating hazardous conditions. Brenda's face flushed a deep crimson red. These accusations are baseless. We followed proper procedures. Jamie stood up next, holding a thick folder. I have copies of the environmental impact study that was submitted before the creek diversion. It specifically warned of potential flooding if the natural watershed was disrupted. She began passing out pages, and here are the emails showing the board received and ignored these warnings. Bob's gavel slammed down again, his voice cracking. Those documents weren't meant for public distribution. They weren't meant to be hidden either, I said, walking to the front of the room. Public records laws made them available to anyone who asked. I turned to face the crowd, my voice clear and strong. I also have the original permits showing the Kirkpatrick's home and several others were built on protected wetland without proper authorization. The room erupted. Parents whose children had been traumatized by flooding, elderly residents whose irreplaceable belongings were ruined, families living in hotels, while mold was painstakingly removed from their homes, all shouting questions, accusations, demands for justice at once. Ava Miller pushed her way forward, her voice choked with emotion. My children can't sleep at night because they're afraid water will come through their ceiling again. Who's going to pay for their therapy? Bob tried to regain control, but his voice was drowned out by the rising tide of anger and frustration. I noticed him exchange a worried, almost panicked glance with Brenda. Finally, Taylor Williams stood on a chair and whistled loudly, piercingly. The room gradually quieted. We've prepared a petition, she announced, waving a thick stack of papers. It calls for immediate board elections and has been signed by over 3/4 of homeowners. According to HOA bylaws, that's enough to force a vote tonight. Brenda grabbed the microphone, her voice shrill and desperate. This is ridiculous. We've maintained property values and community standards. Without us, this neighborhood would fall apart. An elderly man, Mr. Henderson, who I'd never seen speak at a meeting before, slowly rose to his feet, his voice frail but firm. My wife and I have lived here for 30 years. We watched them fill in the wetland to build those fancy houses. Nature always wins in the end. You can't fight water. It goes where it wants. The vote wasn't even close. Jamie became president, with Michael and Taylor elected to the board. Their first official act was to approve a comprehensive water management plan that included restoring my creek. 6 months later, I sat beside my flowing creek, watching tadpoles dart between the smooth, sun-warmed rocks. The water caught the sunlight, throwing shimmering sparkles against the banks where native plants had returned, their vibrant greens and blues a testament to nature's resilience. Neighborhood kids had built a small, sturdy wooden bridge downstream, where they now watched for frogs under their parents' watchful, appreciative eyes. The Kirkpatricks had sold their house at a significant loss and moved away. The new owners embraced the wetland restoration project, even adding bird feeders and bat houses to attract more wildlife. It looks like it was always meant to be here, said Jamie, joining me beside the creek. Because it was, I nodded, dipping my fingers in the cool, clear water. How's the class action lawsuit going? Settlement talks start next week. The HOA insurance is covering most of the damages, thankfully. A blue heron landed gracefully at the water's edge, studying its reflection before stabbing at a small, unsuspecting fish. "You know," Jamie said quietly, "Brenda left something behind when she moved." "What's that?" "A sign. It was in her garage. It said, 'Danger, water hazard. Keep children away.'" Jamie smiled, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "I put it up by the community garden, with a new sign underneath that says, 'Nature, not a danger, but a teacher.'" I laughed, a deep, satisfying laugh, watching the water flow freely, where it had always been meant to go. Sometimes, justice doesn't come from courts or rules or regulations, but simply from letting nature take its course. This story highlights the crucial importance of respecting natural ecosystems and the potential consequences of prioritizing short-term gains, like property development, over long-term environmental sustainability. It demonstrates that human attempts to control nature often backfire, and that working with natural processes rather than against them is ultimately the wiser and more sustainable approach. The story also underscores the power of community action and the importance of challenging authority when it acts against the best interests of the people and the environment. What are your thoughts on this story? Have you ever experienced a similar situation with an HOA or a development project that disregarded environmental concerns? Share your experiences and thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that explore the complex relationship between humans and the natural world.